It's wonderful to be here. No, really, it's wonderful to be anywhere, frankly. I've had a difficult 6 months. For those of you that don't know, and I'm going to talk a bit more about it, but about 6 months ago I was in a very serious road accident. I nearly died 6 months ago, people, so it's really good to be here. And it's been wonderful to come to the event and see so many friendly faces, so many people that I haven't seen in such a long time, and so many new friendly faces too. I'm always so impressed by the people that stand up and do the best demo who have come to the big event for the very first time. So give yourselves a pat on the back if you're one of those. Incredible. The reason I'm here really is partly because it's wonderful to see you guys, but also because I've learned a lot in the past 6 months and I wanted to kind of share that with some of you lot. Also a chance for me to say thank you to some of the many people who have really helped and supported me over the past few months, some of whom are sitting in this room now, so thank yous are coming. And the other reason, I guess, is to prove to myself that I can still do this shit, you know? And hopefully I'm going to prove that in the next sort of half an hour or so. So there's a few things going to happen, really. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what happened to me, talk you a little bit through the journey that I've been on, talk a bit about this and where I am now. Hopefully we're going to learn something. Hopefully we're going to laugh a bit along the way, because that's an enormously powerful thing to be able to do, I think. And hopefully we'll all leave the big event not going, oh, bloody hell, I mean, James is all right, but I was enjoying myself until Friday afternoon. Hopefully we'll go away feeling empowered and feeling, do you know what, life is really worth clinging on to, and he's showed us that. And maybe we've learned a bit about brains and all. So that'll be good, wouldn't it? When I was putting this thing together, as I sat one day in the bar thinking, I should go to the big event. I really ought to do something if I'm going to the big event. I started to think about what I was going to call this little talk. And in the end, I kind of settled on, for a title, something that people have been saying to me for a really long time. Since way before the accident, you know. But it wasn't my first choice for the title. That actually was a phrase that I adopted quite soon after I was discharged from hospital, as a sort of catch-all excuse, really, for anything that I couldn't quite manage to do. It didn't quite seem appropriate for a title for a talk at Big, but it is something that I quite like to keep in mind, just in case everything goes horribly wrong, okay? So if you can just sort of hold the alternative title in mind, you know, I think that would be quite a useful thing to be able to do. So what happened? Well, what happened is that on the 30th of January, there was a freak blowout in a tyre. The car that I was in hit a tree at about 50 miles per hour. That's not a good place to be. In the last session I was in, people were saying, what about some maths? Well, 50 miles per hour is about 22 metres per second. If we look at the formula for kinetic energy, you can find that my body, you can work out my mass later, right? I'm not going to bring that up. About 18.5 kilojoules of energy needed to be transferred from my body as I came to quite a sudden halt. Now, fortunately, that was spread out over a bit of time. I helped with a seatbelt and airbags. But even so, obviously, I did suffer some quite serious injuries in that collision. Which brings me largely to the first person that I want to give a big public thank you to. After the accident happened, a few passers-by stopped and didn't know what to do, but stopped and tried to help. And then a police car came past the scene, driven by a member of Norfolk Police's Armed Response Unit who was pursuing a criminal along the road at the time. He saw the accident and stopped the car. He gave his fluorescent jacket and a handful of traffic cones to members of the public, and then came to look at me and kind of see if there was anything they could do. I had the great privilege to meet this guy. His name's Sean. And I really wanted to kind of show you a picture of Sean, you know, to say a big public thank you to him. But he was so modest, he wouldn't let me show you his picture on the screen. So he looks a bit like this, right, to me. Something he told me when I met him, and he told me quite a few interesting things, some of which I'll share with you. One of the things he told me is that usually the car that he drives has a very sophisticated first response first aid kit in it. So he can act as a paramedic if he's first on the serious scene of a serious accident. The car he was in that day didn't. The most useful thing that Sean had in his first aid kit was a pair of gloves. The pair of gloves, as it turned out, was very useful indeed. Because what Sean did was literally to hold my head together. He held my head backwards to keep the airway open so that I could breathe still, and he held my skull in the same place until the paramedics arrived. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, Sean told me they did a really weird thing. It's like, really, Sean? What did they do? He said, well, they sort of laid you on the trolley, and then they wanted to make sure your head wasn't going to get knocked about anymore, and they literally wrapped my head in bubble wrap. Right? That's what they did, the paramedics. Very sophisticated. Things have come a long way in medicine. And I went for a ride on this. This is the East Anglian Air Ambulance. And they flew me from the site of the accident to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, where another wonderful team took over. I suffered quite a lot of injuries in the accident, as I say, and we'll sort of pick some of those up. But what these guys were really doing was needing to tell the hospital where I was going what they were dealing with. So they carried out a number of very quick assessments. And one that's carried out a lot in the case of serious accidents is to measure people's responses to a scale. It's called the Glasgow Coma Scale. This is it. Have a look at it, and it's fairly sort of obvious what it is, really. There are three areas. So there's about your eyes, there's about speech, and there's about movement. And what they're trying to do is to score your responses. So really to gauge a measure of your consciousness. It runs from 3, score of 3, which is essentially a coma. You can see that there's no kind of movement or response to pain. If they pinch you, you don't do anything. You're not opening your eyes, you're not talking. And the top score is 15. Hopefully people in this room are kind of 14, 15, you know, something like that. When I was admitted to hospital, I scored 5 on this scale. Now, sadly, I don't have the detail from my notes to tell you how I scored that 5. I'll let you imagine that for yourselves, and I wasn't worrying about it too much at the time. An interesting thing, I thought, I can kind of understand how that works. And it struck me that, all of us who stand up in front of groups of people and talk about stuff, we kind of do this, don't we? We're kind of assessing the audience and getting a bit of feedback. So I wondered if perhaps a useful thing for Big might be to adapt this and take the PSE audience response scale, which again runs as 3 to 15. And really just to kind of, to think about what an audience is doing, because we do this intuitively, but actually maybe it would be helpful, seriously, to write it down sometimes. Are they watching? Are they fiddling about with stuff? Have they walked out? Quite important measures that we can kind of think about. So I was taken off to Addenbrooke's Hospital. When I got there, obviously they did a more detailed assessment of the injuries that I suffered, and I'll run you briefly through them. I suffered a fractured rib. I had lacerations to my kidney, one of my kidneys, my spleen. They caused bleeding. There was quite a large blood clot close to my spine. I had a punctured lung, and that very quickly developed an infection within a couple of days. I had a lung infection. Quite bad. They treated those things as best they could, but the most serious injury I had clearly was to my head, the most worrying thing, and also the most obvious. And anyone who's seen me walking around the big event will have noticed there is quite a large scar down my forehead. And it was that tissue damage that Sean, the police officer, dealt with at the scene. He did tell me that when he first saw me in the car, he could see my skull through this gap. So not very nice. And that's what he was holding together, and actually did quite a lot of good stuff to be looking after that. There's also some other things that went on that are much less obvious. I've multiple microfractures to the eye socket on the right-hand side of my face, and there is actually a small skull fracture underneath that scar. Not very nice stuff, as I say. The scar is healing very well, and in part because, I think anyway, because somebody in one hospital suggested that as the scar heals, put a bit of moisturiser on it. Right, a little bit of cream. I think I've got my moisturiser in my pocket. I'll show you what I've been using because it's going pretty well. Maybe some of you already use this stuff and keep a bit kind of spare. Soap and Glory. This is righteous butter. This is the stuff. And some of you think, I've got some of that. But some of you, because this is big, Some of you will be sitting there thinking, yeah, but James, does it really work? You know, it's going to heal anyway. It's a scar, isn't it, right? So you'll be pleased to know that I have been carrying out a controlled experiment with the Soap and Glory Righteous Butter. Because I had a punctured lung, it was necessary to give me a lung drain, which essentially involves the insertion of a tube under each armpit into the lungs. That means I've got 2 scars. They're the same. So this one has been treated twice daily with the Soap and Glory, and this one, nothing. Right? If you'd like to see my underarm scars a bit later on, come and have a word and I'll give you a quick flash. I didn't, sadly, admittedly, didn't start the experiment quite early enough, but I think that there is already a slight difference in the healing rate of the 2 underarm scars. So, drop that in. The other thing that I need to do, obviously, at Addenbrooke's, as well as kind of feeling me bones and checking me over generally, was to try and look inside this thing. You know, what's going on actually inside that guy's head? Because we can't tell that. We can mop the blood out of the way, but we can't really see. So they sent me for a number of MRI scans. So in the big magnetic resonance imaging machine at Addenbrooke's Hospital, I visited there, if I remember rightly, 14 times in 2 weeks. So I had a lot of scans so that they could find out what's going on. This is one picture of my head. There's a few things to notice, and the first thing I noticed is look at the size of that nasal cavity. I mean, I know I've got a big nose, right? I know you weren't going to mention it, I know, but I have. But that's massive. And the tongue as well. We all know the tongue goes a long way right down in the back of the throat, doesn't it? It's a massive thing, massive thing. The other thing that some of you will be too polite to mention but will have noticed is that there are quite a number of prominent lumps on the back of my head, aren't there? They're not to do with the accident. Right? I've always had a very lumpy head. And I'll tell you this weird story. It's a long time ago now, when I was a teenager, hanging around some fun fair, and just for a laugh, I went to see the phrenologist. You know, a phrenologist, they feel the lumps and bumps on your head, right? And they sort of tell you something about your past or your future, whatever they think. Anyway, this lady phrenologist, she felt lumps on my head. This one, in particular, caught her interest. She said, you see that lump on the back of your head there? That means you were a dog in a previous life. Well, she said to me, the dog... I said, no, I don't like dogs. She said, I didn't say you're a popular dog. Right? No, that's the dog lump, right? Just that place and just that shape, she said, very indicative of the dog in a previous life, you see. So, I don't know what I think. Does anyone want to feel it? Can you have a feel and just... So I couldn't resist that. Didn't really go to a phrenologist, I'm not mad. Funny. So, anyway, I told you I was going to do that, didn't I? So there's an MRI scan. It shows a picture inside my head, and it's just one of a whole series of pictures, slices really, through the skull, showing an awful lot of detail about what's going on inside there. And that's great to be able to see. But of course, the neurology team at Addenbrooke's didn't just want to see, they wanted to be able to measure stuff as well. So they did something else. They used something called a cranial access device. There's a rough picture of them. You can kind of see roughly the scale of these things with a ruler there. They're quite big. They're quite big. The cranial access device really measures kind of 3 important things. What they're trying to measure is the pressure. So what is the blood pressure inside the skull? You know, how is that changing? Is it getting too low, suggests a bleed? Is it building up and could cause damage to the brain? They measure the oxygen levels in the brain too. And they do some interesting measurements about brain chemistry. And in particular, they measure the levels of sugars in the blood circulating around the brain and some of the sugar byproducts as sugars are consumed and are processed in the body. It goes in by something called a subarachnoid screw or a bolt. And this diagram will give you a bit of an idea about how it goes. So there's a section through somebody's skull. We've got the brain down here. The sort of blue bit is the brain, obviously. We've got this kind of cavity, and the probe needs to come right down through the skull, through the membranes, right down almost to touch the surface of the brain itself, so that they can make these kind of quite detailed measurements. To get it there, they literally have to drill it through your head, right, in order to get through those layers. There's the hole in my head. If you'd like to see it a bit closer up, catch me later. If there's nobody under my arm, you can have a look at my head. So yeah, they literally, with a bit and brace, in fact, rather than a Black & Decker, drill a hole through your skull in order to insert this probe. I'm going to show you another picture in just a moment, but I should warn you that it's not a very nice picture. I did say in the blurb for the show that there are some horrible pictures in this thing. It's not me, I'll tell you that much, but it is a picture that made my mum cry because it looks a lot like I looked when I was in hospital with this probe device kind of inserted. It's quite big, yeah? And it's producing huge amounts of data that needs to be crunched, right? Constantly churning out data about oxygen, about those sugars, about the pressure levels inside the brain. So when I went for an outpatient appointment at Addenbrooke's and they brought my medical notes out on a trolley, right, most of the information in that enormous file was actually concerned with the readouts of these things. And when I was in intensive care, I was monitored 24 hours a day, not just by a computer, but by a person in order to keep an eye on this information. It was kind of ticking over. The hole is still there, but the hole, as I say, and the scar are both healing very well. But I do still suffer from something to do with this kind of flesh wound. I suffer from something called neuropathic pain. And neuropathic pain is weird shit, right? It's weird. And neuropathic pain, it really hurts, right? That's the first thing to say about it. But neuropathic pain feels like it's here, where the wound is, but actually it's not. Actually, it's another part of your brain telling you that this bit really hurts, right? So it's quite weird. And it's because of the nerve damage that's happened around here. And it's related, a very extreme case, to something called phantom limb syndrome that you might have heard about. Some amputees, say you've had the bottom half of your leg cut off, can still feel the leg, and it bloody hurts, right? Because it was in the tractor 2 days ago, right? It hurts. So you still get that message. But because the pain signal's happening in the brain, not in the site of the wound, typical painkillers don't work, because they tend to work by blocking the message that's travelling along those nerves into the brain, so they don't work. So actually the common treatment for this sort of pain is to give antidepressants, to give drugs which reduce brain activity and kind of suppress that. I'm not taking antidepressants for reasons I'll talk about a little bit later on, which means I do still suffer from attacks of neuropathic pain. What's very typical of this pain is to have a kind of constant sort of pins and needles, kind of buzzing vibration sensation. I get that most of the time. But from time to time that's interspersed with sudden attacks of really very painful attacks, stabbing pains, which can occur anywhere along the line of the scar. At the moment, and it's reduced quite a bit, I'm getting about 3 or 4 attacks a day. I've had 2 while I've been at the conference, so some people have seen this. Most of you probably haven't. I've tried to be quite careful. They are quite scary things to see. But I thought I'd show you what they look like, okay, by way of a demonstration, right? And so if you see one, you'll know what to do. And what to do is nothing, pretty much. A bit of sympathy is nice. A glass of water might help. Don't send me to hospital, right? This is what they look like. Neuropathic pain attack. You ready? Fuck it out! Oh. That's what they look like. So if you see me do that, that is the neuropathic pain. That is part of my brain telling me that this really hurts. But actually, there's probably not much activity going on there. If you're trying to measure the responses of the nerves in that wound, you wouldn't actually see very much action going on at all. Weird stuff. So, there we are. I told you there'd be some horrible pictures. That's me, sort of, I suppose, fairly shortly after discharge, thinking, bloody hell, don't I look great? So I'm going to take a picture of this and put it on Facebook. So everybody will go, wow, James is looking so good. So well healed. Right? Brilliant. So I'm kind of still getting the neuropathic pain. At this stage, I was going to get quite a lot, perhaps a dozen times a day, attacks like that. It really meant I couldn't do very much else. Because it's very hard to treat, all you can do really is kind of wait or go on the course of antidepressants, as I say. So the treatment that I've chosen is to put a little bit of paper in my pocket instead. And the bit of paper says, don't send me to hospital, right? Because if you've ever been to A&E on a Friday night, you spend quite a lot of time sitting around, right? And then get sent home again because there's nothing they can do. So this bit of paper is still in my pocket, and if it happens in public, I will pull it out and profit at people. But the more people who know and understand what's actually going on, then obviously the better that is for me. I can't now go out of the house without my daughter making sure I've got this piece of paper in my pocket. Which I think is quite a nice thing, really. Here's another MRI scan of my head. Different way this time, obviously kind of coming down through the top of the skull. And you can see what's happening behind the kind of tissue damage, the wound that you can see on the front of my head. So the white area inside there shows a bleed inside the brain. So I suffered damage to my brain on the right-hand side. I suffered damage in particular to the optic nerves. And I say optic nerves, plural, because often when we talk about the optic nerve, we think about the optic nerve, that great big wire that connects the retina to the brain and carries all that visual information through to the brain. But actually there are 12 nerves connected to each of your eyeballs, and they control a whole range of functions. Because the eyeball is a very mobile thing, it needs to move about all over the place, right? Your pupil and your lens, there's lots of things going on in the eye. I suffered damage to 3 of my optic nerves, numbers 3, 4 and 6. And they control sort of different things. They're very interconnected, obviously. If we kind of start at the top, I suppose, 6, lateral rectus, that innervates the muscle that pulls the eye to the side. So if you want to see kind of sideways, what's going on over there? Number 6, that's kind of going to do the thing for you. Number 4 does a similar thing, but it does up and down movement, although it also has a rotational aspect to those muscles as well. So your eye goes up and kind of a little bit round to the side. And number 3 controls the eyelid. If you want to open and close your eyes, you're going to be using a bit of oculomotor nerve number 3. And it controls the iris, so the size of your pupil. Obviously that changes in reaction to light levels, and that's controlled by number 3. As I say, I've suffered damage to all of these things, so I've got problems with my right eye. I learnt some interesting things though. The pupil's quite interesting. Everybody knows that if you get a torch and you shine it in your eye, your pupil gets smaller, right? It's a control element. You knew that, right? But did you know, maybe you did, maybe it's just me, if you shine a light in your eye, both pupils change. I never knew that. Isn't that weird? Right, that's quite cool. So mine don't. Right. If I shine light into my left eye, the left pupil will get smaller, the right one will stay the same. If I shine a pupil into my right eye, the right pupil will stay the same, but the left one will still change. Right. Yeah, weird, isn't it? Yeah, freaky stuff. Freaky stuff. So I've kind of got this eye patch. You've all been seeing me doing my pirate impression walking around. And apart from possibly applying for a job with Pirate Walks, which is advertised downstairs, it's kind of a bit of a nuisance, really. When I was in rehab, I thought getting into rehab would be more pleasurable than this, but you can't have everything, I suppose. But when I was in a rehab hospital, a consultant came around and brought some students with him, 3 students, and he asked these girls to do some simple tests on me, and actually in particular to test my vision. So he asked the first girl to do a very simple thing, just to watch the movement of my eye. So she'd hold a pen in front, and I'd have to move my eye and try and watch kind of how it moved. Fine, okay. So then he asked one of the other students, can you do the other eye, please? She, yeah, okay, sure. Because of damage to number 3, my eye was permanently closed at that time. I couldn't move the eyelid. So the consultant said, you'll have to raise the eyelid. So she put a thumb onto my eyelid in order to raise it. Just as she was about to lift the eyelid, she's paused and said to the consultant, he has got an eye under there, hasn't he? Now, quite an important question to ask, granted. Maybe not quite the best way to ask it. I know, but you'll be pleased to know that I have got an eye under there. And if I take my patch off, you might be able to see it. I have got an eye under there, and it does have vision. Right? But there are some problems with the eye. Now, there has been already some improvement in the function of these oculomotor nerves. You can see that my eyelid is open, and I can move it. I can kind of do that. I still can't control the iris, so the pupil size is fixed. And although I can sometimes move my eye sideways, I have hardly any movement up and down at all in the right eye. That leads to a few problems, but it also gives me a bit of a funny look. Right? I tend to look a bit like this. It's called down and out because of the way that the eyeball kind of gets pulled to the side. And it's kind of diagnostic of oculomotor nerve palsy. So I have palsy, it's kind of drooping sensation in the eye. What it means is that what I can see now, that I've taken my patch off, is all of you guys, twice. Right? The world kind of looks like this to me. I have permanent double vision. Because whilst this eye can move around and focus on different things, whatever I'm choosing to look at, the other eye is fixed in the same place. That's kind of okay. I can probably cope with it like this, standing fairly still. If it's very busy, there's lots of things moving towards me, it's very hard to track where they're moving because this eye always looks in the same place. So not the same thing, but in the same place. If I'm walking, that's quite tricky too, right? Because stuff is flying past and you don't kind of know where it is. So the double vision can cause dizziness, sometimes nausea, comes some balance problems as well. But it is much, much better now than it was kind of in the past. But it's also very important that I use the poor eye, because the only way those nerves are going to recover is through use. Right? I put them to a bit of a test, I get them kind of doing their thing. So quite a while ago, sort of start of May really, was when I was first brave enough to actually start trying to do that. And it was also about the time I was thinking about doing this talk, right, funnily enough. So let's video that. Right? So what I thought I could do is just go for a walk. And I could go for a walk by closing my right eye, and then I could try and go for a walk by closing my left eye. Right? And we'll kind of see if there's any difference. So I've shot a couple of videos. I hope, technology permitting, these are going to work. So the first video is me walking with my right eye, the poor eye closed, and the left eye open. So we'll have a bit of a look and see what happens. There we go. It's terrible, isn't it? When I shot this video, I thought, God, I was going to use that in the show, and I'm way too good. So let's have a look at the other eye. So the same thing, I'm just going to be walking along, but I've got the other eye this time going. There we go. Pretty poor. Okay, pretty poor. Very, very hard for me to focus and to stay balanced walking along with just the bad eye, and that's still pretty bad. Shall I try it now? Wasn't going to do this, but let's give it a shot. So, right eye only open. I'm getting better, right? Yeah. Right? So looking just with the poor eye, it was very, very hard for me to balance, and that is improving. But there was also something else going on, and it was going on in both of those videos. Right? You may have noticed me doing something else a bit kind of weird. So we saw this before. Obviously, got the bad side of the head there with the damage to the eye and so on. But actually, there's something more going on inside my head. Right? And in actual fact, the bad side of my head is the other side. Right? The other side. There's the kind of MRI scan chopped down through the middle of it. We just need to spend a moment to think about what brains are really like. We've seen quite a few pictures of brains and spongy brains and all sorts of things over the last couple of days. It's been quite interesting for me to see those things. The only brain I've ever seen, I think, was in Think Tank, and it was a pickled one on gallery there. It was quite cool. I've seen a few pictures, and I thought I'd try and read a bit about them, you know, try and find out what brains are really like, so try and get some understanding of what's going on. So there's an organisation called Headway. It's a charity concerned with people who suffer from brain and head injuries. And this is what they said about brains in their sort of intro guide. Brain weighs about £3, the texture of blancmange. Okay, that's kind of cool. And it goes on to say a little bit more about the kind of patterns inside the brain. We've got these contacts and networks between the brain cells. I've got one here. And between the axons and the dendrites of those neurons inside the brain. those pathways. What struck me is the kind of second half of that bit there. The effect of a head injury on this delicate substance is similar to that of vigorously shaking a plate of blancmange. And I thought, a lot of people are going to read this leaflet and they're going to go, yeah, blancmange. Yeah. But then I thought, what, this is big. We're going to make a blancmange right? And vigorously shake it, aren't we? Because that's what this organisation kind of does. Right? So here's my brain. Right, there it is. And it is kind of spongy, right? And I'm told that this texture really is quite realistic. Does anybody want to have a poke of my brain? Because we don't see blancmange very much these days. Yeah? Isn't it? It's kind of, it's sort of soft and squidgy. A poke of my brain? There's no dirty thoughts in there. It's not catching. Right? Yeah, so it's this thing. Right? And you can see that it is kind of wobbly. So inside the skull, obviously you've got the brain, it's got those membranes around it that we saw in my image earlier, the dura, the thicker one around the outside. But the brain isn't very tightly held inside the skull, it can move around. And if we give it a shake, you can see that it starts to move. And if that happens inside the skull, it will actually impact onto the surface of the skull, and that can cause damage. And if it gets shaken very, very vigorously, you will get, as it says here, these sorts of sheds and tears coming down through the side, which cause damage to those connections between the neurons, will kill some of the neurons inside the brain. And that kind of happened to me. Sadly, I haven't got an MRI picture which shows where the damage I suffered is, but it was on the thalamus, which is roughly where it's circled inside this picture. It's not a large area of damage, and it's on the left side of my brain. So that's why that's the bad side, the left hemisphere. Now, you probably know this weird thing about brains, that the left hemisphere of the brain generally controls things that happen on the right-hand side of the body. And this damage has left me with some problems on the right-hand side of my body. A general kind of loss of sensation down the right-hand side of my body. It doesn't mean that the right-hand side of my body is completely numb, but it doesn't mean that it's not as sensitive as the other side. Right? If you kind of give me a poke, I can feel that, but not quite as strongly as I would on the other side. And there's a little bit of a difference there. And it's not just that kind of sense of touch that's affected. The sixth sense, proprioception, is also affected. Give you a little bit of an idea of what proprioception is about. I want you to try and experiment with me, right? So bear in mind that I'm not going to be very good at this, right? I want you to get your right hand and hold a finger up out in front of your face, okay? I want you, like me, to close your right eye as well. You must make it fair. Take your other hand and put a finger behind your head. And what you're going to do is bring that finger over the top of your head and land it right on top of the one in front, okay? Go. Right? It's fairly tricky, but it's not impossible, okay? Most people should kind of be able to do that. Now, it's a little bit hard because you've lost some depth perception. Now, we don't just rely on stereoscopic vision for depth perception, right? There are other things going on as well, but it is helpful. And something that I suffer with a bit of a lock-off is loss of his depth perception. But the more important thing that's going on there is this proprioception. And proprioception is a sense of self-awareness. It's your sense of where all the bits of your body are, right? So you ought to be able to do that with both eyes closed, right? Because you know where that finger is because you just put it there. So give that a try. Right finger out in front, both eyes closed, finger behind your head, over the top, and see if you can land it on the one in front. How'd you get on? Yeah? If you're really struggling, right, if you find it very difficult, you can reinforce the sense of proprioception simply by tensing the muscles in your right hand and your right arm. Yeah? So give that, if you find it difficult, give that a try. Sort of tense them. You don't even have to keep them tense, just tense them for a bit to send that signal so you know where it is. Yeah? And that should make it a bit easier. Yeah? What I've got is some damage to that proprioception, so it's harder for me to be aware about where the right-hand side of my body is. So in those videos of me walking, what you might have seen is that I was looking down a lot. And the reason I was looking down is that I didn't know where my foot was. Right? Sounds like a weird thing, but I have to keep checking where my right foot is when I walk, particularly if I'm going down a hill or down steps or something like that. You need to check just to reinforce that proprioception to know what's going on. The other thing that happens on the left hemisphere is that it's connected with speech, vocalization. If you've heard me stammering at all, I'm going to do it a lot now, I know. If you've heard me stammering or stuttering or slurring words a little bit, that is because, again, of this left hemisphere damage that I've got. Makes it very, because I'm thinking about it, makes it difficult to do. The main symptom, though, of a head injury, regardless really of where it is neural fatigue. You get very, very tired. The way that consultant described it to me is it's like a motorway closure. So you've got all these connections between the neurons, these pathways through your brain. They're like the motorways, the ones you used to be using. Phew, those thoughts are connected straight away. If you've got damage, your brain needs to find new pathways. It needs to make new connections for that information to go. So it's like travelling by the A roads instead of the motorways. You can still do things, but they take longer and they make you more tired. So any kind of physical or cognitive activity is very tiring when you've had a head injury. Neural fatigue, not very good. But there's not much you can do about it. Because you can't replace those damaged or killed brain cells, you've just got to reinforce those new pathways. That can be done, but it does take quite a long time. And there isn't really any kind of treatment that can be given for that either. You just need to kind of wait. So all the hospital teams can do really is just check how you're doing. And they do that with some quite simple tests, right? Just simple kind of cognitive tests that you can do, simple motor tasks. The consultant, my last appointment, asked me to sit down, cross my arms and stand up. Right? Not complicated stuff, right? You can do it. What was done with me quite a few times when I was in hospital was the nurse would come in, and I didn't know at the time really what she was doing, but she was getting to test my recall and my memory, and also this kind of cognitive function, just by getting me to do something simple like naming animals that start with a certain letter of the alphabet. Right? Once a nurse came in and she said to me, "Okay, I just want you to name things that start with P." It's not hard, right? So I go penguin, parrot, polythene, and I did, I don't know, I suppose 5 or 6, and then I got stuck. And then the other bit of my brain was going, "You got stuck. Say something, man. Say something," right? And it wasn't a long time. I'm sure it was a fraction of a second. I said something. So, and I swear, this is embarrassing, but this is what happened. I looked directly at this nurse and said, "Plump." Right? No. But then it gets worse. Right? Then my brain was going, "You just said she was fat. What do you do that for? Say something else." So I went, "Pretty." It's not helping. It's not, I don't know where that came from. And you know, for the record, she was neither particularly plump nor pretty. At all. But I do, well, I'm told anyway, have a bit of a habit of embarrassing myself in front of the nursing staff at the various hospitals that I've been in. I have, I should perhaps mention earlier, complete amnesia for about 3 weeks of my life, so I don't remember this at all. But my family delight in telling me that while I was in Addenbrooke's, I did try to chat up one of the nurses and was quite insistent that she ought to give me her phone number. Right? And when she politely declined, her email address, Facebook, right? But, you know, it's got to be worth a try, isn't it? You know, if she's working in hospital, maybe that's because she's attracted to men with things sticking out of their heads, right? And embarrassing habits of removing their catheters in public. I don't know. That's all I've got to go on. So anyway, I digress. What I want to do is just try one of these kind of neural tests on one of you. So can I have a volunteer to come and try something out, right? Or you can just kind of see how Rachel gets on. Come and stand. I'm going to turn that picture off because it's getting... Okay, so here's the plan. All I want you to do is just remember 3 words, okay? So penny, apple, tree.
Penny, apple, tree.
Okay, penny, apple, and tree. That, all you got to do is just kind of retain those in your head, okay? What I would like to do now is to get your left index finger, and I want you, when I tell you, to touch your nose, and then your right shoulder, and then your left knee. Okay, go. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, what were the 3 words?
Penny, apple, tree.
Penny, apple and tree, that's brilliant. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is just spell the word world backwards.
D-L-R-O-W.
Yeah, brilliant. And what were the 3 words?
Penny, apple, tree.
Penny, apple, tree. Excellent. Give Rachel a big round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very, very simple tests. Tests in short-term memory, tests in recall. That was exactly the test that I did and utterly failed. Okay? I couldn't spell the word world backwards. Right? Interestingly, when I went to my most recent outpatient's appointment, the neuroscientist said, "I'm going to do some tests on you." I thought, "Ella, I bet he does that world thing." Right? And he did. The same word. Right? And because I knew he was going to do it, I was going, like, D, yeah. So I knew it, so I passed that time, right? Just because he chose the wrong word. I should have told him, really, but I couldn't face it. So very, very simple things, right? Yeah, and What's really, really difficult to do when you've got this kind of brain damage and these new pathways being formed is anything that involves an element of multitasking. So trying to do more than one thing at the same time is really very difficult. And what you're doing in the test like that is you're trying to remember something and you're trying to obey an instruction and follow some quite simple instructions to do simple things. If you take another leap and do something that requires a bit of cognitive work, think about spelling a word backwards, that can be really quite difficult. So multitasking for me, a problem. Add that to the fact that I'm already a man, right? And you can see there's going to be a bit of trouble somewhere kind of along the line there. So that kind of brings us to the end of my time with you, really. I just wanted to bring you up to speed and tell you where I am at the moment, show you a couple of great pictures. Sadly, I'm not allowed to drink or drive. I'm not allowed to drink because the consultant tells me don't do anything that might hurt your head, right? And funny enough, just before I was discharged, I went to see the consultant, and I'd been sort of out on a few day trips, you know, get used to what home is like, sort of thing. And he said to me, "Have you been out anywhere, Mr. Piercy? Have you walked to the shops?" I said, "I've walked to the pub." His face fell. I kid you not. Please don't drink. Right? Please don't drink. When I went to another appointment, the guy said, "Please don't drive." It's like, I haven't got a car, right? I really don't want to drive. It's like, hand in your licence, right? So I did have to surrender my driving licence. Because of the fatigue, I also have to go to bed quite a lot, right? So if you haven't seen me over lunch, that's because I've been down the road to sleep. Right? Things are very, very hard work. In terms of what's happening in the kind of development, well, they reckon that neural fatigue, you need to wait 2 years after the injury. After 2 years, you'll probably stay pretty much as you are then. So there's perhaps a limit to the improvement, but it is possible in some cases people do make a full recovery in that sort of time, but it's kind of unknown. So that's the sort of negative stuff, I suppose. The positive things that are happening, the scar, healing really, really well. Bit of that neuropathic pain, as I said, still kind of kicking in, but you know, it's going. And I do get to go to bed a lot. Right? You've got to put a positive spin on these things, haven't you? I've got a bus pass, right? It's quite hard coming to terms with the fact that you're disabled, but you do get to sit somewhere on the bus. Right? It's quite cool. You do get funny looks off old ladies, right? At which point you have to sneer at them and point at your scar, right? If that ever happens to you. And I'm here. Yay! I'm here. So as I said at the start, it's been a long and difficult journey, and I'm probably only quite a short way into it, really. But I know that with the help and support of you guys and my family and friends back home, I'm going to keep going. And I think I still can do this shit. And that's progress. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Oh, I'm going to have to go back on. Thank you. You will make me cry. Thank you.